I'm David Wessel from the Hutchins Center on Fiscal and Monetary Policy here at Brookings. This is the largest collection. This is all the remaining people in Washington who care about the federal budget. This is it. And I'm kind of worried that that's not a joke. I want to welcome everybody to the Tax Policy Center's 4th Annual Donald Lubick Symposium. The symposium was launched in 2016 to honor Don's extraordinary record in promoting tax policy. Don has a distinguished career. He went to the University of Buffalo, was a veteran of the U.S. Army Air Force. That's not a typo. I looked it up to make sure that's what it was called at the time. And Harvard Law School. He's taught in a number of law schools. Don has served every Democratic president from Kennedy through Obama. And in between, he did some work in the private sector, and he has returned to government repeatedly until he retired. And we're very happy that Don is with us today, his wife Susan, his son Jonathan, and daughter-in-law Viola Lubick, who traveled from Israel to be with us today. I'll spare you the Netanyahu jokes, but because the real reason we're here today is to celebrate this book, Bill Gale's new book, Fiscal Therapy, Curing America's Debt Addiction and Investing in the Future. It's a very ambitious book because I think it's 2 books in one. Half of it is an incredibly comprehensive survey of how the federal budget works, taxes and spending. But then, unlike a lot of other people, instead of just damning the problem, Bill puts his neck out and offers solutions, a detailed list of solutions which actually add up. Which is another thing that distinguishes him from some of the other people who talk about budgets in Washington today. So we're very happy to have this opportunity. On behalf of the Hutchins Center, I need to plug our computer game on the budget, so you can see if you have a better plan for bringing us to fiscal sustainability than Bill Gale. And there's an iPad out in that corner outside the room and this one, and some of our RAs are there, and we encourage you to try it. And if you don't get a chance, you can play it online, fiscalship.org. We think it's a good way to help crystallize the choices that people have to make. So our plan for the day is we're very lucky to start off with a presentation by Doug Elmendorf, who is now the Dean and the Don K. Price Professor of Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Doug has been in and out of Brookings over the years. He's been at the Treasury, the White House, the Federal Reserve, and of course was director of the Congressional Budget Office from January 2009 through March 2015. And I've always admired his ability to crystallize the fundamental fiscal challenges we face in words that even members of Congress can understand. After Doug speaks, Bill's going to make a presentation about his book. He's been allotted 20 minutes. And at 20 minutes, I want everybody to stand up and face the back of the room so he knows that his time is up. So we'll have time for a panel with Doug, Bill, Maya McGinnis, and Michael Strain. So with that, Doug Elmendorf.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I am delighted to be back at Brookings today and honored to have been invited by Bill to offer my views on this important occasion. Bill Gale has been one of the most thoughtful and interesting voices on U.S. tax and budget policy for 30 years. If you have not spent enough time with Bill and his writings to know that, then this is your chance. This book offers you, in one place, a collection of great information and great wisdom. If you do know Bill and his works well enough to understand why he has been such a thoughtful and important contributor to the budget policy discussions, this book is also your chance to have a lot of Bill's information and wisdom in one place. So all of you should have a copy of this book. And if you don't already, then you should certainly get one on your way out. I have learned a tremendous amount from Bill over many years, and I learned a lot more reading this book. So I really commend it to you. I also want to say here at the start how grateful I am to Bill for giving me the opportunity to join Brookings in 2006. At that point, I had been in Washington for more than a dozen years, and I'd been lucky enough to have interesting jobs where I could be engaged in policy discussions. But those had mostly, my role had mostly been in the shadows. And Bill decided to take a chance on bringing me out into the public domain. And that opportunity to come to Brookings changed my life, as chances to come to Brookings have changed in many people's lives over many decades. And I'll always be grateful to you, Bill, for taking that chance on me and bringing me in to this place and giving me the opportunities that have followed. Bill's terrific book, Fiscal Therapy, is about making choices. As he explains, federal debt is larger relative to the size of the economy today than at almost any point in our nation's history. And under current policies will continue to rise indefinitely as far as the eye can see. That path is not sustainable, and therefore we will be forced at some point to make choices that increase federal taxes, reduce federal spending, or both. But Bill views the necessity of making choices as an opportunity as well, and I think that is exactly right. As Bill explains, the federal government is not taxing or spending in ways that advance our national interest very effectively. Productivity growth is slow by historical standards, yet we have reduced federal investment in infrastructure and research and development to nearly the smallest percentage of total output in my lifetime. Inequality has risen significantly and economic mobility has declined, yet we have not responded with policies to expand access to high-quality education and training for either young people or older people. The share of the American population over age 65 is rising to unprecedented levels, which increases federal spending on our largest and most popular benefit programs. And yet we have reduced taxes to the smallest percentage of GDP than any sustained period for 80 years. And the tax system we do have, the way we raise revenue, is neither efficient nor equitable. We can do better. We need to do better. And the way to do better is exactly as Bill says, which is to, quote, focus on realistic solutions, unquote, based on, quote, facts and evidence, unquote. There is much that economists and policy analysts don't know about how the world works. And our prescriptions for fiscal therapy should be offered with some humility, just as prescriptions for physical therapy should be offered with some humility. Nonetheless, there is much that economists and other policy analysts do understand about the effects of federal policies based on historical experience and careful research, and that knowledge should be used in forming policy. Bill's book presents the crucial facts and evidence about federal budget policy that elected officials should use in making budget decisions. I agree with many of Bill's specific recommendations on both the tax and spending side, and I'm really delighted to see so much good sense in one place that I will carry around and refer to when I need it. But I decided that rather than run through Bill's menu, I will focus on one issue, and in particular an issue where my views may differ somewhat from Bill's views or the views of other members of the panel. That issue is whether we should be trying to reduce budget deficits in the near term. I think we should not. Specifically, I think the evidence shows that reducing projected budget deficits will be necessary ultimately, but would be a mistake to do now. Let me explain. My starting point is the low level of interest rates. The U.S. economy is now roughly at full employment, which is wonderful, and the federal funds rate is only 2.5%. Most members of the Federal Open Market Committee expect a slight further increase at some point, while financial market participants are split about whether the next move will be up or down. Thus, 2.5% seems pretty close to the equilibrium short-term interest rate in today's economy. The yield on 10-year Treasury notes is also about 2.5%. That implies that financial market participants expect interest rates to stay close to 2.5% on average over the next decade. And even longer-term Treasury interest rates are also consistent with short-term rates staying close to their current level on average for a very long time. Now, to be sure, predicting interest rates is very difficult. If I was really good at it, I would be speaking to you on a remote video link from an island in the South Pacific, and I'm not. So one should take interest rate predictions with a grain of salt. Nonetheless, both logic and empirical evidence imply that a future of low interest rates is likely. As the financial crisis was beginning over a decade ago, the picture of interest rates that many of us had in our minds was low rates in the 60s, a peak of rates in the 70s and 80s, and then lower rates again in the 90s and aughts. Interest rates fell in the financial crisis and recession, which was not surprising, but they didn't rise much after that, which is surprising. If you draw a picture of interest rates today and drop off the period before 1990, so you can rescale, what you see from 1990 to today, now almost 30 years, is a consistent, significant decline in interest rates. A pattern of 30 years standing is not just a flash in the pan. In addition, a similar decline in rates can be seen in many countries around the world. And as Lucas Rachel and Larry Summers pointed out here at a meeting of the Brookings Panel on Economic Activity last month, the global decline in interest rates has occurred even though public debt has surged in this country and many others. As this pattern of globally low interest rates has become more apparent, a number of analysts have examined a large number of possible explanations. Some of the possibilities involve a declining demand for capital, stemming from a diminished capital intensity of production, slower trend growth of the labor force caused by demographic changes, and slower growth in total factor productivity. Other possibilities involve specific features of Treasury securities that might push down their yields relative to the return on capital. And there are other possibilities as well. I think a fair summary of this growing literature is that explaining interest rates, even in retrospect, is a complex and uncertain business, but that there are good reasons for rates to stay low for the foreseeable future. If interest rates really will stay low for a long time, what does that mean for our subject today? Well, persistently low interest rates represent, quote, a sea change for federal budget policy, unquote. That quotation is from a paper that I wrote with Louise Shaner. In 2015, we published in the Journal of Economic Perspectives in 2017. We wrote in the paper that it is well understood that lower interest rates change the dynamics of the federal budget. For any given gap between non-interest spending and revenues, lower interest rates cause federal debt to compound more slowly. But it is less well understood that low interest rates change the desirable levels of deficits and debt. Analyzing the implications of low rates for federal debt, for optimal federal debt, is complicated in part because the implications vary to some extent, depending on the reasons that interest rates are low. My paper with Louise has a whole set of forks in the decision tree based on different explanations for what's been happening in financial markets. We have, if you're interested, there is a summary version of our analysis in the Journal of Economic Perspectives and a longer, more technical version that still lives on the Brookings website. Our bottom line was, quote, many, though not all, of the factors that may be contributing to the historically low level of interest rates imply that federal debt should be substantially larger than it would be otherwise, unquote. Now, you should not just take our word for it. Other economists, including some more distinguished economists, have been toiling in this vineyard of late and have reached similar conclusions. And I'm not aware of research that has examined the effects of interest rates on optimal debt that has reached contradictory conclusions. Therefore, I think it is appropriate at this point to conclude that the United States should have substantially more federal debt than most economists would have argued for several years ago. And that conclusion further implies that there is less urgency to putting federal debt on a sustainable path than most economists would have argued several years ago. This line of thought does not say that federal debt can rise indefinitely relative to total output, which is what would happen under current laws and policies regarding revenues and spending. Let me emphasize, debt cannot rise indefinitely relative to total output, and none of the recent research that I'm referring to suggests otherwise. Therefore, reducing federal budget deficits will be necessary at some point. The crucial question, though, is when should deficits be reduced? And I think this literature and a set of points I will make now argue that the right answer to the question is that we should not aim to reduce deficits now. There are legitimate reasons that we should reduce budget deficits in the near term, but I think those arguments are less consequential than they first appear and are, in my view, significantly outweighed by the arguments for delaying action. Let me explain. One legitimate argument for acting soon is that interest rates might rise unexpectedly. And as I noted, interest rate predictions should be taken with a grain of salt. Current predictions might be wrong. Rates might rise a lot quickly. And I think we should hedge our bets and make budget decisions that would not be terrible if interest rates turned out to be higher than we expect. We should also consider policy in the light of what we would think if interest rates turned out to be lower than we now expect, which is also a possibility. Indeed, Larry Ball and Greg Mankiw and I wrote a paper 25 years ago in which we analyzed the implications of recognizing the risk in the economy, and in particular the risk that interest rates might rise a lot, and economic growth might fall a lot, and debt that had seemed sustainable at a point in time would turn out to be unsustainable. We concluded that Treasury interest rates have often been low in American history precisely because they represent a hedge against certain kinds of risk. And therefore, sensible policymakers should take out insurance against negative developments by accumulating less debt than they would in a world of perfect certainty. But as I noted earlier, current interest rates are quite consistent with the evolution of rates over 30 years now. That is not just a flash in the pan. And moreover, interest rates were generally quite low before the run-up in the 1970s. So the anomalous period looks increasingly like the 80s and 90s, not what has happened, or the 70s and 80s rather, not what has happened in the past 30 years. So as a result, I think we should hedge our bets in formulating budget policy, but only to a limited extent. I think a second legitimate argument for acting soon to reduce projected budget deficits is that significant changes in budget policy should be enacted well before those changes need to take effect, so that the people whose benefits or taxes are being changed can plan ahead. For example, as many of you know, we are still phasing in an increase in the full retirement age for Social Security that was legislated almost 40 years ago. And the gradual pace of that increase has helped some people plan ahead. However, most changes in tax rules and spending programs do not need to be announced far in advance. Moderate increases in income or payroll tax rates, for example, do not require significant advance notice. And many people are not very far-sighted anyway about government policies, even when they are already in law. After all, if everyone was saving an optimal amount based on a rational forecast of their future income, we would have much less need for Social Security than we actually have. So I do worry a little about announcing certain changes in policy ahead of time, but I don't think that we need to announce all of our changes very far ahead, and that reduces the urgency of acting in advance, well in advance of the problem. I think a third legitimate argument for acting soon to reduce projected budget deficits is that elected officials tend to avoid hard budget choices, and therefore analysts should keep the pressure on. And we see this sort of avoidance in a whole collection of federal budget decisions over the past decades. We see it in decisions by state and local government leaders to promise large pensions to current employees and not fund those pensions. And we see this in other ways as well. But we should recognize that this inclination toward budget laxity is not an absolute. Our policymakers did not cut taxes or increase spending sufficiently in the Great Recession, with significant negative consequences for Americans. German policymakers performed even worse, with terrible consequences for a significant number of people across the Eurozone. I did think in 2011 and 12, when I was watching very closely, that the Congress would have been more likely to enact short-term fiscal stimulus if our long-term fiscal outlook had been brighter. There is an argument for brightening that long-term outlook in order to encourage short-term action. But I now think that our long-term fiscal outlook will never become sufficiently bright that everyone will feel sanguine enough about it to justify short-term fiscal stimulus on that basis. And we'll just have to make the case for short-term fiscal stimulus on its own merits. Moreover, I think we should be very careful as analysts to shade our analyses to offset what we perceive as biases in elected officials' behavior. Our responsibility as analysts is to offer the best, most objective analysis we can and leave it to our elected officials to make those decisions. So if those arguments for near-term action are not as strong as they first appear, what are the arguments against near-term action? I think there are two important ones. First, increases in federal taxes or reductions in federal spending would slow the economy in the short run. And with the federal funds rate as low as it is, the contractionary effect of fiscal tightening would be dangerous for our economy. Fiscal tightening would reduce aggregate demand, and all else equal, would reduce output and employment in the short run, even though it would be good for output in the long run. under the circumstances that we have viewed as normal for most of our professional lives, that contractionary short-term impulse would be offset by easing by the Federal Reserve. But current circumstances are not normal in the traditional sense. The Fed does not have much room to cut the federal funds rate. Therefore, reducing budget deficits today would present a significant risk of reducing output and employment with all of the attendant economic and social costs. The second reason I think we should not take action to reduce budget deficits in the near term is that most of the reduction should stem from an increase in revenue, and Republican leaders are not ready to support revenue increases. We should focus on increasing revenue because decreasing spending in the ways that I think would be most likely, and I will explain in a moment, would be worse for our society at this point than letting budget deficits continue. Let me explain. It is important to realize that there is no appetite in either of the major parties for significant cuts in our large federal benefit programs. The current Republican president has promised to maintain Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, although his actual proposals contradict that promise. And a Republican-controlled House over 8 years voted on no legislation that would substantially reduce federal benefits, except for repeal of the Affordable Care Act. If the Republicans will not try to cut those large benefit programs, surely the Democrats will not either. There's also little appetite in either party for significant cuts in annually appropriated non-defense spending. Such spending is already nearly the smallest percentage of GDP in more than half a century. And no matter how much some elected officials like to complain about wasteful government spending, they also realize that their constituents want to have their food inspected, their borders patrolled, their highways built and repaired. And those things are funded through non-defense discretionary appropriations. Moreover, there was little appetite among a number of people in both parties for substantially cutting defense spending. So on the spending side, that leaves only the benefits focused on lower and middle income Americans. If federal spending was cut in the near term, this is the category of spending that would bear the brunt of those cuts. Contrary to some assertions that the current structure of benefits provides a comfortable hammock for people who do not work, that is not the case given the level of benefits and the conditions of the people who receive them. There is a growing body of evidence suggesting that at least some of the benefits enhance rather than diminish the life prospects of children who receive the benefits. And we have experienced several decades of widening income inequality and declining upward mobility. In these circumstances, cutting benefits for the people who have gained the least from overall economic growth during the past several decades would be a perverse policy action. And yet, given the current resistance among Republican leaders to any tax increases, much less significant tax increases, I think that any efforts to reduce budget deficits in the near term would end up cutting benefits for lower and middle income Americans. Therefore, for both economic and social reasons, I think we should not aim to reduce federal budget deficits in the near term. However, we will need to do so eventually, and in the meantime, we can and should work hard to improve, quote, the ways we tax and spend, as Bill opens his book. And in Bill's excellent book, he offers a tremendous number of important suggestions for how we can tax and spend in ways that are more effective in advancing our national goals, and we should pursue that agenda with great vigor. Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.